All right, we are back with section 4 of our public policy course. And this subsection is all about theories of or methods of coming to a consensus or um, getting other people to vote the way you want them to vote, right? Now, the kind of most famous method of doing this is bargaining, right? Because power is dispersed among lots of different individuals, both in Congress and in other parts of the government and other public policy making organizations, you need to kind of be able to, give and take. You need to be able to bargain with those around you to get anything done. Because if everybody only voted their personal interests every time, nothing would ever get done. Now, in order to bargain, you have to be willing to negotiate. You have to be willing to say, okay, well, let's figure out how we're going to do this. And, I want A, but you want B. Let's find some way to compromise. Let's find some way to make this, make a C option that is acceptable to both of us, where neither of us get everything we want, but, we're going to kind of figure out what's going on, right? And then each side has to have something the other wants, right? If I have absolutely nothing you want, you have no reason to bargain with me. There's nothing I could do to make you want to do what I want to do, or at least a part of what I want to do, right? And this bargaining can be explicit or implicit. And this is kind of, by explicit we mean, worked out vocally or, by a text, obviously. But very kind of open. Whereas implicit is just kind of assumed, like, all right, I'll do what you want on this one, but then, clearly I'm going to expect a kind of a future favor later on, right? Now, in Congress, there are kind of 3 different methods of bargaining. And these can be used for other organizations, but it's really the most obvious in Congress. And that's log rolling, side payments, and compromise. Right? Log rolling means, listen, I'm going to vote your way on this bill that I really don't have much interest in, doesn't really benefit me in any way. If you vote my way on this other thing that I do have an interest in, right? So maybe, hey, this new budget has, possible a bridge in my district, and if you vote for that part of it, I'll vote for the other part of it where there's a new road in your district, right? And then we can both say, hey, we got this passed for our constituents, and we'll both get reelected next time, right? So, I'll do what you want on this thing if you do what I want on this other thing, right? Side payments means, we can't pay legislators to vote the way we want to with, like, cash, right? That would be illegal. We have had numerous public policy makers get arrested or face other punishments for doing exactly that. So we can't, say, hey, vote our way on this bill and we'll give you $100,000. But congressional leadership can use other forms of kind of payment or benefit for members in order to get them to vote certain ways or do certain things, right? So maybe, a majority leader might go up to a Congress member of their party and say, hey, if you vote our way on this certain bill, we'll make sure you get a better office, or we'll give you that plum committee assignment that you've really been wanting, or some other kind of benefit that it's within their power to give that is non-monetary, right? And then finally, there's compromise. And compromise is the way kind of we all wish Congress would work. And it does a lot, but not necessarily the way we want. And compromise just means, more of this, less of that. We'll find some middle ground, right? And it can either be, look, I want to spend $100 billion on this issue. You don't want to spend any money at all. Can we both kind of agree if we set it to 50 billion? Or, maybe one of us is in a more powerful negotiating position. So, look, if you agree to vote for this bill, I'll go from 100 billion down to 80 billion. Or if the other person or the other legislator is in a better position, instead of $100 billion that I want, I'd be willing to settle for 20 billion, right? Or, especially common in the field of criminal justice is, hey, we both want to reduce drug usage, right? Drugs are bad. We don't want a bunch of heroin addicts or meth addicts out there. So one party might say, look, if we can spend, I want to spend $100 billion on drug treatment facilities and needle exchange programs and, specialized drug courts. And the other group might say, no, we need to spend $100 billion on more police and more prisons and stuff. So they might come to a compromise with kind of 50 billion for each of those two kind of areas, because they have the same goal, i.e. reducing drug usage, but different ideas on how to achieve that. So they might compromise by saying, we've got this much money to spend on this issue. If we give half to my idea and half to your idea, we'll all, none of us will be totally happy, but it's kind of enough of a middle ground that we'll be able to pass this drug fighting bill, right? So compromise can work a few different ways, but it's, more or less of this or that in order to get everybody to kind of agree and move forward with that law or that policy or whatever. Now, persuasion. In a perfect world, persuasion would be ultra powerful and really amazing, and we'd all be able to be persuaded. But in reality, the vast majority of people, including the vast majority of policymakers, are kind of stuck in their views, and no amount of persuasion will kind of change their minds about certain issues. But there are a lot of cases where persuasion is still used. In Congress, representatives and senators will frequently kind of get up in front of the assembled group and try to persuade everybody, like, hey, we clearly need to do this because it's very important, and here's how it's going to impact the American people. And how often they're successful, I don't know. I assume it's not that often. It's probably a lot more common for Congress to persuade each other kind of behind closed doors, and especially members of their own party. So if I'm a member of a certain party and I feel really strongly about this issue, and I know there's another member of my party who doesn't necessarily agree with me, I might try to persuade them, not on the floor of the chamber, but, in the lunchroom. Sit down next to them while they're eating lunch and say, hey, this is really important and here's why. And that kind of background, that kind of behind closed doors persuasion is way, 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 way more common than the kind of public, we're going to argue on the floor of the House or the Senate kind of persuasion. And then, of course, persuasion happens all the time in the courts, right? I mean, think about any case heard before the Supreme Court. What happens? Well, the Supreme Court, those 9 people all get up there and they sit, and then 2 lawyers or 2 groups of lawyers will try to persuade those justices to rule for their side. So this side is going to try and persuade the judges to make a certain ruling, and then this side is going to try to persuade the judges to make a different ruling. So the entire process of arguing a case, especially an appellate case, before a judge is just a matter of persuasion. It's a matter of kind of talking people into it, making those other people see the issue the way you see the issue and make the decision that you want them to make. Now, another way you can do this is command, right? You do not have a choice. Make the decision that I want you to make. This is difficult because it requires a hierarchical relationship, right? One senator going up to another senator and saying, you have to do this, or what? What are you going to do? You didn't vote me in. I don't need you to have my job. So it requires somebody to kind of be your boss, so to speak, right? So say the president can issue one of these commands to, say, the vice president or the head of a executive agency. But it's not very common in things like the legislature, right? Because it requires that power imbalance, which is not necessarily there when it comes to legislatures. Now, when it does come to the legislature, a huge part of the work there is creating majorities. We have this group of people who want to make a decision. We need a majority to be able to do anything. How can we kind of create that majority? Right? How can we get past the limit that we need to get to in order to move this along to the next stage in the process? Well, we can use persuasion, we can use bargaining, all those things, but it's really, really, really difficult. You know, a lot of commentators have remarked that getting a majority in Congress is like herding cats, right? For lots of reasons. Number one, there are tons of decision stages. There's subcommittees and committees and the full House and the Senate and subcommittees in the Senate, you know. So there are lots of different stages where you need a majority. So each one of those stages is going to require persuasion and bargaining and things to move it on to the next stage, where you might need to do more persuasion and more bargaining and more this and more that, and then move it on to the next stage where you need to do more. So it can be really difficult to find a series of compromises and a series of persuasive arguments that not only work once, but work at every single level. And you can't make a compromise at stage 1 that you know is going to be a complete deal breaker at stage 4. Because then there's no point. It's never going to become a law. It's never going to become an official policy. So this majority building is very, very difficult. As I said in the last slide, in Congress, in the legislature, there's not a lot of ability to command people, right? There might be some cases where, say, the congressional majority leaders or minority leader might be able to go up to a freshman senator and say, look, you have to vote this way. And even though they don't technically have power over that person, the person can be new enough or desperate enough that they say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I will do that, and accept that command. But there's really not a lot of hierarchical, in a strict sense, relationships in legislatures. And then finally, another difficulty is that for a lot of what Congress does, for a lot of what all of the legislature does, whether state level or federal level, you need 50% plus 1. But in a lot of cases, and for a lot of situations, you need a supermajority. Sometimes it's 60%, sometimes it's 2/3, sometimes it's 3/4. So things like overriding a presidential veto. You don't need 50% plus 1, you need 2/3. Right? So it's not just a majority you need, it's a supermajority, which makes things even more difficult. Then there's things like overcoming a filibuster in the Senate. Basically, in the 21st century, if you want to get anything done in the Senate, you need to make sure that it's not going to be filibustered, and in order to end a filibuster, you need 60 votes. So it's not 51 votes you need to pass any law through the Senate, it's 60. Right? And because of that, I'm not aware of any instance in the 21st century where one party has controlled 60 plus seats in the Senate. It's been close a few times, but it's never hit 60. And so even with a majority, the majority is usually anywhere from, 51 to 54, 55, that kind of thing. So you might get close, but it's almost impossible to pass anything through the Senate without that majority of 60% instead of 50%. Now, for presidents, they look out, or executives, could be governors, could be, any executive position. Presidential decision making is kind of a little bit more focused on, they don't have to worry about necessarily majorities of groups of people trying to agree with them. So what do they look at when trying to make a decision? Well, legality, right? Contrary to what a certain former president has said, not everything a president does is legal, right? They can't just make any decision they want and say, okay, that is now our policy, or that is now what we're going to do, right? So they have to look at the legality of any given policy alternative. Then they have to look at acceptability. If it's something that's going to have to pass Congress, is it going to be acceptable to Congress? Is it going to be acceptable to the American people? Is it going to be acceptable to the international community? Right? Then they have to look at resources. We only have so much time. We only have so much money. We only have so much manpower. We only have so much of lots of these different resources. Physical resources like water and electricity, all the way up to abstract concepts like money. Then they have to look at previous commitments, right? Especially with foreign policy. If we want to make a certain deal with Japan, we have to make sure that doesn't violate the terms of any previous deals we made with Canada or, some other country. And then, of course, there's information. We all like to imagine that, especially the president, but really we would hope that everybody, it kind of is able to know everything they would need to know in order to make any given decision. But it's not always possible, right? Especially in very short time frames with large crises, right? Whether it's 9/11 or a hurricane or an earthquake or the stock market crash of 1929. Information is slow to kind of trickle in. There's a lot of confusion in the first hours or days after some big event like that. And a lot of times it's best to hold off on making a decision until you get more information and are able to make the right decision, right? Another thing presidents have to worry about is that the course of a 4-year term, or if they get reelected, 8 years, is marked by increasing effectiveness but decreasing influence, right? So increasing effectiveness because both the president themselves, but also the staff around them, the people they've appointed to various roles, they get more experience with the job. They start knowing what they're doing more and more and more. They just kind of get better at it as they go along. So they're going to be better at doing their job as that presidential term goes on, again, either for 4 years or 8 years. The problem is they usually also have decreasing influence, right? So as their term goes on, their ability to influence other people into going along with what that president wants goes lower and lower and lower and lower, right? So for instance, it is very, very common, although not exclusive, for presidents to lose, their party to lose seats in the midterm elections after their election, right? So we saw this, say in 2016, Donald Trump was elected president as a Republican. In 2018, the Republican Party lost a huge number of seats in the House of Representatives. And that kind of thing is relatively common. If a president from one party gets elected in a certain year, almost without exception, their party is going to lose seats in Congress 2 years later. So that decreases the amount of influence that president has on what policies pass through Congress. Then there's public opinion, right? If you look at any recent president, whether it's Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, you can go back for many decades, and you'll see that every single time they start office with a nice high approval rating from the public, and then as time goes on, it goes down. And sometimes it comes back up, such as in the case with George W. Bush. His his approval rating was down, 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 down. And then 9/11 happened and it shot back up. And then, of course, started going down again. But so things can kind of influence it later on in a presidential term. But almost without exception, a president's highest approval rating is going to be right in the first couple days of their administration when their effectiveness is at its lowest, right? So as those 4 years or 8 years go on, effectiveness goes up because they know what they're doing more. They have more experience, more connections, more ability to get things done. Whereas their influence, either with the American people or with the Congress or with other groups, gets kind of less and less and less and less. All right, that is the end of our lecture on decisions. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you guys.